Now, when we talk about Pakistan's role in a conflict like this, the first thing we have to understand is that geography is not just a backdrop; it is an active force in shaping outcomes. And Pakistan sits at one of the most strategically sensitive crossroads in the world. It connects South Asia with the Middle East and Central Asia. It borders Iran. It is close to key maritime routes in the Arabian Sea. And it sits within reach of some of the most important and volatile geopolitical theaters in the world. That position creates both opportunity and risk. Opportunity because geography gives Pakistan relevance. In moments like this, countries that sit at strategic intersections often become important players, whether they intend to or not. Their territory, their airspace, their diplomatic position can all become part of the broader equation. But at the same time, that same geography exposes Pakistan to spillover effects. And spillover is one of the most underestimated dynamics in modern conflict because conflict doesn't respect borders. It travels through refugees, through trade disruptions, through security threats, through information and perception. When instability increases in a neighboring region, countries like Pakistan feel it almost immediately, not always in the form of direct confrontation, but through pressure that builds across multiple dimensions. And now, let's think about what that means psychologically. For any state, proximity to conflict creates a different kind of awareness, and it's not abstract anymore. It's not distant. It becomes immediate, and that immediacy influences decision-making. Leaders begin to think not just about long-term strategy, but about short-term stability. They begin to assess risks in real time. They begin to prepare for scenarios that under normal conditions would remain theoretical, and that shifts the tone of governance. Because when your neighborhood is unstable, your margin for error shrinks. Now, one of the most important aspects of Pakistan's geographic position is its proximity to Iran. That proximity matters for several reasons. First, it means that any escalation involving Iran has the potential to create ripple effects across the border. Those effects may not always be direct, but they can manifest in security concerns, economic pressures, or even social dynamics. Second, it means that Pakistan is in a position where it cannot afford to be passive. It has to monitor developments closely. It has to engage diplomatically, and it has to be prepared for contingencies. Because in geopolitics, proximity is responsibility, and that responsibility often comes with difficult choices. Now let's layer in the maritime dimension. Pakistan's coastline along the Arabian Sea places it near critical global shipping lanes. These routes are essential for the movement of energy and goods between regions. And in any conflict that affects nearby waters, the implications are significant. Because global trade depends on stability. Ships need to move, ports need to function, insurance costs need to remain manageable, and confidence in the system needs to be maintained. But when conflict introduces uncertainty into that system, everything becomes more fragile. And for a country like Pakistan, that fragility can translate into economic pressure very quickly. Now let's move to another dimension, strategic relevance. In times of conflict, countries that might otherwise be seen as peripheral can suddenly become more central because they sit at key junctures, because they can influence access, because they can act as conduits for diplomacy, logistics, or even de-escalation. And Pakistan has historically played that kind of role. It has acted as a bridge between regions, a facilitator of dialogue, a partner to multiple global actors with different interests. And that positioning gives Pakistan a certain kind of leverage, but it also requires careful management because increased relevance brings increased scrutiny, and increased scrutiny brings increased pressure. Now let's talk about internal implications. When a country is situated near a conflict, the psychological impact can extend inward, public perception shifts, security concerns become more prominent, political debates become more intense, and leaders have to manage not just external risks, but internal expectations. Because populations are sensitive to instability, they want reassurance, they want clarity, they want to feel that their country is secure. And when regional tensions rise, that sense of security can be challenged, which means that internal cohesion becomes even more important. Because in moments of external pressure, internal unity is a stabilizing force. Now let's think about how all of this interacts. Geography places Pakistan in proximity to risk, but it also places Pakistan in proximity to influence. And those two things are often intertwined because the closer you are to a conflict, the more you are affected by it, but also the more you can potentially influence it. So Pakistan is not just a passive observer in this scenario. It is an actor with agency, but that agency is shaped by constraints, economic constraints, security constraints, diplomatic constraints. And understanding those constraints is key to understanding Pakistan's likely response. Now, here's the deeper insight. Geography does not determine destiny in a rigid sense, but it does define the parameters within which decisions are made. And those parameters matter because they shape what is possible. They influence what is risky, they define what is strategic, and they limit what is realistic. So when we talk about Pakistan's position in this conflict, we are really talking about a balance between exposure and opportunity, between vulnerability and influence, between proximity and distance, and maintaining that balance requires careful, deliberate strategy. Because in a world where conflicts are increasingly interconnected, no country can afford to ignore its geographic reality. It can only learn how to navigate it. And that brings us to the central point. Pakistan's geography does not just place it near this conflict, it places it within the system that this conflict is shaping. And that means the decisions made in response to this moment will not just affect the present, and they will define Pakistan's position in the regional order that emerges next. Because in geopolitics, geography is not just where you are, it is what you must deal with. And how you deal with it is what defines your future. If geography defines where Pakistan stands in this conflict, then economics determines how it will feel it. Because the reality is simple. Wars in one part of the world rarely stay contained in that part of the world. And for a country like Pakistan with a highly interconnected and still developing economy, the shocks travel quickly through energy prices, through trade routes, and through confidence itself. Let's start with energy. Pakistan is heavily dependent on imported oil and gas. That means global energy markets are not just a distant indicator, they are a direct driver of domestic economic conditions. Now, when conflict intensifies in a region like the Middle East, energy markets react almost instantly. Prices rise, supply chains become uncertain, insurance costs for shipping increase, and suddenly what was a manageable import bill becomes a growing burden. But here's the deeper issue. It's not just about higher prices, but it's about volatility, because markets don't just respond to what is happening. They respond to what might happen. And that anticipation creates instability. For Pakistan, this means inflationary pressure. It means currency stress. It means that the cost of transportation, production, and even basic goods begins to rise. And inflation is not just an economic metric, it's a psychological one, because when people feel that their purchasing power is eroding, trust in institutions starts to weaken. That's the hidden cost of economic instability. Now let's look at trade. Pakistan's economy depends on a delicate balance of imports and exports. It imports energy, machinery, and raw materials. It exports textiles, goods, and services, but in times of regional conflict, trade becomes more complicated. Shipping routes can become less reliable, trade insurance becomes more expensive, and international buyers begin to factor in risk when engaging with suppliers. That means Pakistani exports may face indirect pressure even if the country is not directly involved in the conflict. And at the same time, imports become more costly and less predictable. This dual pressure creates a squeeze, a tightening of economic space. And when that space tightens, policymakers have fewer degrees of freedom. They must make difficult choices between competing priorities: controlling inflation, stabilizing the currency, supporting growth, and maintaining fiscal discipline. Now let's talk about remittances. For Pakistan, remittances from overseas workers, especially those in the Gulf, are a critical source of foreign exchange. So they act as a stabilizer, a lifeline in many ways. But when regional tensions rise, labor markets can be affected. Economic slowdowns in Gulf countries can impact job security, wage levels, and the flow of remittances back home. And if that flow slows, Pakistan feels it almost immediately, because those inflows are not just numbers in a balance sheet. They support families. They sustain consumption. They help stabilize the broader economy. So any disruption in that system has both macroeconomic and human consequences. Now let's consider foreign reserves. Countries like Pakistan rely on foreign exchange reserves to manage their currency and pay for imports. But in times of global uncertainty, maintaining those reserves becomes more challenging because capital flows become more cautious. Investors begin to reassess risk. They look for stability. They look for predictability. And in a world where a regional conflict is escalating, emerging markets can sometimes face capital outflows, which puts pressure on the currency, which in turn feeds back into inflation. This is how economic systems become interconnected. One variable influences another, and another, and another, until the entire system feels the effect. Now, there's a psychological dimension to this that we often overlook. Economies are not just driven by data, they are driven by expectations. Confidence matters. If businesses believe the future is stable, they invest. If consumers believe their future is secure, they spend. If investors believe a country is reliable, they commit capital. But when conflict creates uncertainty, those expectations shift, and that shift can slow economic activity even before any actual disruption occurs, because perception leads behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. So in a sense, part of the economic impact of conflict is anticipatory. It happens in the mind before it happens in the market. Now, for policymakers in Pakistan, this creates a difficult balancing act because they must respond to external pressures while maintaining internal stability. They must manage inflation without stifling growth. They must stabilize the currency without restricting trade too heavily. They must reassure investors while also protecting domestic interests. And all of this must be done in an environment that is, by definition, uncertain. That's not an easy task, but it is the reality of operating in a globalized system. Now, let's step back and look at the broader philosophical point. Economic systems are often described in terms of numbers, policies, and institutions, but at their core, they are systems of trust. Trust that agreements will be honored, trust that currencies will hold value, trust that markets will function as expected. And conflict introduces doubt into that system. It challenges assumptions. It disrupts patterns. It forces recalibration. So when we talk about how this war affects Pakistan economically, we are really talking about how it affects the underlying system of trust that supports economic life. And that is why the impact goes beyond immediate indicators. It shapes expectations. It influences decisions. And it defines the environment in which the next set of choices will be made. Because in the end, economics is not just about resources, it's about confidence. And in a time of conflict, confidence becomes one of the most valuable and most fragile assets a country can have. So the question for Pakistan is not just how to respond to economic pressure, it's how to preserve confidence while navigating uncertainty. Because in a world shaped by volatility, stability is not just an outcome, it is a strategy. And the countries that understand that distinction are the ones that will navigate this moment most effectively. If geography places Pakistan near the conflict and economics transmits its pressure into daily life, then security is where the impact becomes most immediate and most personal. Because when instability rises in a region like this, it doesn't just remain at the level of geopolitics or markets. It moves into the domain of security, both external and internal, and that's where the stakes become sharper, more sensitive, and far more complex. Now, let's be clear about something. Pakistan is already a country that has experienced the consequences of regional instability over many years. It has dealt with militancy, cross-border tensions, and internal security challenges. So the system is not starting from zero. There is experience. There are institutions. There is awareness. But what makes this situation different is the scale and proximity of what is unfolding. Because when conflict escalates in a neighboring region, the risk is not just theoretical, it becomes operational. Let's begin with the most obvious concern, spillover. Spillover doesn't always mean direct conflict crossing borders. It can take many forms. It can be the movement of people, refugees seeking safety. It can be the movement of ideas, ideologies that gain momentum in moments of chaos. It can be the movement of networks, groups that take advantage of instability to reorganize, recruit, or expand influence. And each of these forms creates pressure on Pakistan's internal security environment because the more unstable the region becomes, the more variables Pakistan has to manage within its own borders. Now, from a strategic perspective, this puts Pakistan in a position where vigilance becomes essential. Border security becomes more than a policy issue. It becomes a daily operational priority. Intelligence sharing becomes critical. Military readiness becomes more than deterrence. It becomes preparedness, and law enforcement faces increased demands. But here's where it gets more complex. Security is not just about military or policing capacity. It's also about perception. Because in moments of regional tension, perception can amplify reality. If people believe that instability is rising, their behavior changes. They become more cautious. They may become more anxious. They may begin to interpret events through the lens of fear rather than stability. And that shift in perception can influence everything from political discourse to economic behavior to social cohesion. So now security is not just about managing threats. It's about managing narratives. And that leads us to another important dimension, internal cohesion. In times of external pressure, internal divisions can become more pronounced. Political debates can intensify. Regional differences can become more visible. Social tensions can become more sensitive. And in a country as diverse and complex as Pakistan, managing that internal balance is critical because external pressure tests internal unity, and unity is what allows a country to absorb shocks without fracturing. Now, let's talk about something that is often overlooked in discussions of security, the psychological impact. When a country is in close proximity to conflict, it affects how people think. There is a subtle but important shift in mindset. People begin to think in terms of risk. They begin to ask different questions. They begin to look for signals of stability or instability in their environment, and that mindset can influence behavior in profound ways. For example, it can affect investment decisions. It can affect migration patterns. It can affect how communities interact with each other. because uncertainty changes how people engage with the world. And when enough individuals begin to operate from a place of uncertainty, the broader system reflects that. This is why security is not just about preventing worst case scenarios. It's about maintaining a sense of predictability. Now, from a geopolitical standpoint, Pakistan's position also means that it must carefully navigate its relationships with neighboring countries and regional actors, because security is not isolated. It is interconnected. Actions taken by one state can influence the security posture of another, and in a region where alliances, rivalries, and historical tensions already exist, this becomes even more delicate. Pakistan must balance deterrence with diplomacy. It must maintain readiness while avoiding escalation. It must protect its sovereignty while engaging constructively with others. And that balancing act requires both strength and restraint. Now, let's take a step back and look at the deeper pattern here. In moments of conflict, countries are often forced to confront a fundamental question: how do you maintain stability in an unstable environment? Because instability is contagious. It spreads through proximity, through interaction, through perception. And the only way to counter that is through resilience. Resilience in institutions, resilience in governance, resilience in society. And resilience is not built overnight. It is built through preparation, through experience, through the ability to adapt under pressure. Now, here's the key insight. Security is not just about avoiding threats. It is about managing uncertainty, and managing uncertainty requires clarity. Clarity in strategy, clarity in communication, clarity in decision-making. Because when people understand what is happening and why it is happening, they are better able to respond to it. And that applies at every level, from government to society to individuals. So when we look at how this conflict affects Pakistan, we are really looking at a test of systems, a test of leadership, a test of resilience. And how Pakistan responds to that test will shape not just its immediate security environment, but its long-term stability. Because in geopolitics, security is not just about defending borders, it's about maintaining equilibrium in a world that is constantly shifting. And the countries that succeed in doing that are the ones that understand a simple but powerful principle. In times of uncertainty, stability itself becomes a form of strength. And preserving that stability, that is the real challenge. If geography defines proximity, economics defines pressure, and security defines risk, then diplomacy is where Pakistan's choices are tested in real time. Because Pakistan is not operating in a vacuum. It is operating in a highly interconnected geopolitical environment where relationships are not just beneficial, they are necessary. And in a moment like this, those relationships become more complex, more sensitive, and more consequential. Pakistan's diplomatic challenge is not simple. It is not about choosing one side over another. It is about managing multiple relationships simultaneously, each with its own expectations, its own pressures, and its own strategic logic. Let's start with Iran. Pakistan shares a border with Iran, a long-standing relationship, and a set of shared regional interests. At the same time, there are tensions, differences, and occasional points of friction. So Pakistan cannot afford to disengage from Iran, but it also cannot afford to be drawn into instability involving Iran. That requires a very careful diplomatic posture, engagement without escalation, communication without alignment, cooperation without entanglement. That is not easy to achieve. Because in moments of heightened tension, neutrality itself can be interpreted as a position, and that creates pressure. Now let's move to the Gulf states: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain. These countries are not just economic partners. They are also critical sources of financial support, energy cooperation, and employment opportunities for millions of Pakistanis. The relationship is deeply interdependent, but it is also sensitive to regional alignments, because Gulf states have their own strategic interests, their own alliances, their own security concerns, and Pakistan must navigate those carefully. It must maintain strong ties without appearing to be taking sides in a conflict that could affect those very relationships. And this is where diplomacy becomes less about statements and more about signals, because in international relations, what you say matters, but what you imply often matters more. Now let's consider China. China is one of Pakistan's most important strategic partners. The relationship is rooted in long-term infrastructure investments, economic cooperation, and shared strategic interests. But China's approach to global conflict is different. China prefers stability. It prefers predictability. It prefers economic continuity over geopolitical confrontation, which means that Pakistan's relationship with China is shaped by a shared interest in stability, but also by China's broader global positioning. And that requires alignment, not just in words, but in outcomes, because partnerships like this are built on trust over time. Now let's talk about the United States. Pakistan's relationship with the US has historically been complex. It has gone through phases of cooperation and tension, alignment and divergence, And in the context of this conflict, the US remains a major global actor with significant influence over international security dynamics. So Pakistan must manage that relationship carefully as well. Not just in terms of policy, but in terms of perception. Because in geopolitics, perception shapes trust, and trust shapes cooperation. Now, here's the key insight. Pakistan is not just balancing relationships, it is balancing expectations. And expectations are often more difficult to manage than policies. Because each of these actors, the US, China, the Gulf states, Iran, has expectations about how Pakistan should behave. And those expectations don't always align, which means Pakistan is constantly navigating a narrow path, trying to maintain credibility, trying to preserve flexibility, trying to avoid being pulled too far in any one direction. And that requires a very high level of diplomatic discipline. Now let's bring in a psychological perspective. Diplomacy is often seen as a technical field, but at its core, it is deeply psychological because it involves understanding how other actors think, what they value, what they fear, what they are trying to avoid. And in moments of conflict, those psychological dynamics become more intense because uncertainty increases. And when uncertainty increases, so does sensitivity. So a statement, a decision, or even a silence can carry more weight than usual. This is why timing matters. This is why tone matters. This is why consistency matters. Because diplomacy is not just about reacting to events, it's about shaping the environment in which those events are interpreted. Now, let's step back and look at the broader strategic picture. Pakistan is positioned in a way that gives it potential leverage because it is connected to multiple key regions. It has relationships across different power blocks. It has the ability to engage with different sides, but leverage is only useful if it is managed carefully. Because overextension can lead to loss of credibility, and loss of credibility can reduce influence. So the goal is not to maximize alignment with any one actor. The goal is to maintain strategic autonomy, the ability to make decisions based on national interest rather than external pressure. And that is the real challenge of diplomacy in a moment like this. Because external pressures are real, internal expectations are real, and the margin for error is small. Now, let's bring this to a philosophical level. Diplomacy at its best is about creating space for dialogue, space for de-escalation, space for cooperation. And in a world that is increasingly polarized, that space becomes more valuable than ever. Because without it, conflicts escalate more easily. With it, there is a chance, however small, to manage tensions before they become crises. And Pakistan, because of its position and relationships, has the potential to contribute to that space. But only if it navigates this moment with clarity, consistency, and restraint, because diplomacy is not just about who you stand with, it's about how you stand. And in a world where every move is observed, interpreted, and analyzed, how you stand may matter just as much as where you stand. So the real question for Pakistan is not simply how to respond to this conflict. It is how to position itself within a system that is being reshaped by it. Because in geopolitics, the countries that endure are not always the ones that take the most visible stance. They are the ones that manage the most complex balance. And that balance, that is where Pakistan's future will be defined.